Hey, welcome to Deep Dive. I'm so glad you're here. I've been away for a while, haven't been in Deep Dive, so I am excited to be back and looking at Acts chapter 9 with you today. We looked in our sermon about how grace spreads, how if we have been the recipients of this incredible grace of Jesus Christ, that our responsibility is to spread it to everyone around us. And today, as we look at Acts chapter 9 again, there's a couple things I want to point out that we didn't talk about during the sermon. The first is the first verse of Acts chapter 9. It starts with the word meanwhile. Meanwhile is a connector word. Whenever you see the word meanwhile or and or therefore, it means you need to look before the passage at what's happening. And so when we see this word meanwhile, it means that something's happening at the same time that Saul is having his Damascus Road experience. And so what's going on? Well, what we find out in Acts chapter 8 is that Philip is traveling around Samaria, and the grace of Jesus Christ is being encountered by Samaritans, and grace is being encountered by an Ethiopian, and grace is spreading throughout the region around Jerusalem and Judea. And this is exciting. And then, you know what we notice too is there's a second meanwhile in Acts chapter 9, and that immediately follows the story about Saul. In verse 32, it says, meanwhile, Peter traveled around from place to place. And it tells us that Peter has been going around from Samaria as well as other places, spreading the grace of Jesus Christ until he comes to a place called Joppa where he settles. And it's in Joppa that he has this vision of a sheet coming down, and the Gentile mission really begins from this vision in Acts chapter 10. And all of that is happening at the same time that Saul is having his Damascus Road experience. Why is this important? Because I want you to see God's amazing plan at work. He has this amazing meanwhile plan. You see, while Saul is being confronted with his need for the grace of Jesus, the Samaritans are experiencing the grace of Jesus. The mission is beginning to be open to the Gentiles, and Saul is in the middle of it as Jesus calls him into relationship and then calls him to be the missionary to the Gentiles. And God has this amazing meanwhile plan that he's working all sorts of different things at the same time. Why is this important? Because it means as you think about sharing your story of grace, it means that God is working over here, and he's moving things around and getting people in place so that as you are preparing to share your story of grace, he's got people that he is moving around in the meantime, getting ready for you to share your story of grace. And so tell me, do you want to be a part of God's meanwhile plan, just like Saul was? The second thing I want you to see is Ananias' role in all of this. You know, when we talked during the sermon, we focused a lot on how Saul went from place to place after he encountered the grace of Jesus and he shared his story of grace. We talked a lot about proclamation of grace. But Ananias is kind of this background story that we don't always pay a lot of attention to. Ananias was this man who was available to Jesus. He was available to Jesus so that Jesus was able to say, why don't you go to Judas's house on Straight Street and talk with this man named Saul? And Ananias shared the story of grace with Saul because he was available. And you know, as much as we talk about proclamation, I think this idea of us being available to Jesus is equally important. You see, I think a lot of us are not going to be in a situation where we preach the gospel like Saul did, but we are going to be in situations where we just need to be available to Jesus to spread the grace of Jesus. And Ananias is available to Jesus. He goes to Judas's house on Straight Street. He begins to talk with Saul. And what does he talk to Saul about? Well, he shares what Jesus shared with him. The things that God told him, he begins to pour out into the life of Saul. And this is really crucial for us because sometimes we get scared of sharing the story of grace that we have because we don't think it's enough, or we don't think that God has really given us anything to share. And we need to understand that God has given you everything you need right now for his meanwhile plan. He's given you what you need to share his story of grace. And what you are responsible for, well, it's kind of like emptying out a cup. You see, think of your life like a cup. And Jesus has poured into your cup some of his grace, or a lot of his grace. And he just wants you to pour that grace out for somebody else. This is what you're responsible for doing. Not sharing something more than you have, but just sharing what you have. And then at the end, Ananias prays with Saul. I mean, this is something that each of us can do. We can pray for someone, pray that God would bless them, pray that God would fill them with his grace. And I think a lot of us are going to have roles like Ananias. We may not be like a Saul, but we will be Ananiases for people. And we need to be available, willing to pour out what we have received, and willing to pray with people. And this is how grace spreads in God's meanwhile plan. Are you ready to be a part of it? I am. Let's go. Let's share the grace of Jesus. Let's make grace spread. Hey, thanks for watching Deep Dive. I hope you'll join us next week. If you liked what you heard or you have questions, be sure to post or tag us. We'd love to hear what you're thinking, how you're interacting with this content. And do share it with your friends as well, because I think there's something of grace that needs to be spread through this today.